In many countries, we've come to the conclusion, the case of El Salvador, an obvious one, where more than 1/3 of the population is now living outside of El Salvador. And that 1/3 that's mostly in the United States produces 3 times the GDP of El Salvador, and has more than 3 times of the savings and financial service potential for the country outside of the country. And you cannot really speak about human development in El Salvador without understanding this transnational dimension to it. Likewise, in the United States, I think there was a huge wake-up call, to some anyway, a couple of days ago on the importance of this diaspora here, and that is changing here, and the very direction of the politics in this country, if you will. Many of them who came from and both economic and also political relationships of long-standing between the United States and Latin America is now dramatically changing the future of this country. How do we begin to start looking at these issues of human development from an international perspective, particularly since the biggest crisis in the industrialized world, I would suggest, of human development is occurring right here in the United States, with more than 12 million people who basically are excluded from basic rights, legal rights, as well as economic rights. And together, how we deal with the challenges of human development across this North-South diaspora is what we've been focused on for many years. What I want to talk a little bit about is what we're defining as the vicious cycle, if you will, of post-conflict transnational relationships, which are not only increasing elements of inequality within the country and also actually in the United States. The Salvadorian population, as well as other migrant populations in the United States, represent the largest growing source of, if you will, the base of the pyramid in the United States in terms of lack of access of a number of ability for economic growth and of income. And what we're looking at is how are these dynamics being transmitted both through a migration system, which is still primarily undocumented, even though in the case of El Salvador, there is something called TPS, temporary protective status. Most of the population is still coming here as an undocumented population and basically living at about less than 20–25% average wages then compared to what they would probably have if they were legalized. And what we've done is mapped out village by village, zip code by zip code in the United States. I don't have my internet, but I'll give you the website that allowing you to look at this essentially very dense corridors of migration, which we're tracking in the UNDP report, that essentially look at the ways in which the inequality in access to human development in El Salvador is linked now to inequalities of access to human development capabilities in the United States. And like I say, this is not only being maintained through an unequal access to immigrant rights and labor rights, but also through the fact that they're unbanked. The highest concentrations, for example, in Los Angeles, where I live, where actually is the largest Salvadorian city in the world. It's actually bigger than the capital of El Salvador in terms of its population of Salvadorians. It's not only high, we have more than 1 million undocumented families. About 200,000 of them are actually Salvadorian undocumented families. But as I said, their access to capital is extremely limited in financial services, as well as paying the highest costs associated with basic financial services, getting their checks cashed and sending their remittances back home. We actually estimate, I had sent my students out and make them live as undocumented families for a while to figure out how to survive. It actually turns out to be a very difficult skill. And the cost of being poor is extremely high, as we know, and actually the poorer you are, the more you pay through a variety of services. And then we are now looking into the villages where this all starts, right? And the dynamic in the villages that is receiving, as I said, 20% of GDP in a cash dynamic. And we were talking about this yesterday and earlier today. We're doing it through creating something that's really never been done in an extensive manner, which is serving binational households, detailed surveys of how the families live in the United States, how the families live in El Salvador, and how villages, village economies now in El Salvador are completely interdependent with what happens in certain zip codes in Los Angeles. And actually, I'm dying to get to North Boston here, which turns out to be where 60% of the people from one village from Aguachapan all live. All right, and how, because they're one of our cases where we're seeing that, that the village back home not only depends on that remittance for the equivalent of almost 90% of GDP, of the local GDP, but it is very interdependent with the prices mechanisms that are going on in these villages. Land prices in the immigrant sending areas and the remittance receiving areas are now skyrocketing, all right, such that it really doesn't even make any sense for people, and not only land prices, but health prices. We were discussing health earlier today. It's extremely expensive to go to a doctor in many of these rural areas, and the first thing that they're going to ask you when you go into a clinic is not whether you have insurance like they do here, but whether you have an immigrant family or not, because that's how they know whether they're going to get paid or not. So the same thing on the educational system, and making it that when you go to these communities now and you ask the children, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? Everybody's hand goes up and they want to be a migrant. All right, that's what you do, right? That's what we're preparing for. All right, I mean, I saw the same things in villages throughout most of south of Mexico, which are now entering into this dynamic. At the same time, production, local activity, rural activity in a country that's extremely biodiverse and very productive, which is why it's the most densely populated country in Latin America. It really has a very high rate of potential productivity, agricultural productivity, is essentially has been abandoned for many reasons, leading even before the war, concentration of lands in export agriculture, and later now it's basically abandonment of land. It doesn't make sense for many people, both in terms of having access to very high-priced land, as well as the opportunity cost for labor has gone down significantly compared to what you can be doing. So actually, the good news is there's reforestation of the rainforest going on now throughout El Salvador through this declining in population. But it raises a number of very serious problems for the future of the country, obviously. The main thing is that El Salvador is one of the most rapidly aging countries in Latin America. And like in Mexico, you're probably going to be in a situation where this remittance boom, this is going to, just like previous oil booms or even other speculative booms, are going to decline. And we're already seeing declining rates of entrance into the migrant stream. Not unlike, actually, other countries that have experienced, Southern Europe, for example, which had huge migration. Greece was actually the #1 migrant exporting country in around 1970, from even more than Spain and Italy. And now it's zero outmigration and zero remittances. Actually, it was part of their problems. We're looking at longer-term dynamics for El Salvador, and that, in a sense, they have a very short period of time within the next couple of decades. And clearly that all has to begin in the first decade with significant reform of a really significant type, associated with this momentary boom in remittances, which is definitely sustaining levels of consumption and income growth in certain parts of the country. But if you look at the households in the villages that are receiving remittances compared to the non-receiving remittances households, well, obviously the ones receiving remittances are doing extremely well. The income, the inequality is growing between the receiving and non-receiving. But when you take out the remittances from those households, they're actually much poorer. Poor in terms of assets and poor in terms of their ability to sustain themselves over time. And we're doing projections in terms of what would happen to these local economies without remittances or the country as a whole, both macroeconomically and development options, does not look good. So interestingly, about 3 years ago, the guerrillas who were fighting in the countryside, who then did the peace treaty, won a democratic election. Actually, very few cases where that's happened, and I was invited by the government, by the new government, to come and figure out, well, what can we do? This work that we're doing in Mexico, what types of things could we be doing in El Salvador? So we looked at this vicious cycle, working with the UN. It's vicious cycle in the sense that it continues to deepen not only then the dependence of the country to outmigration, but of a certain type of outmigration in a context of very low rights, obviously, and then which actually ironically is feeding the demand for more immigrants in the United States, right? Federal Reserve of Atlanta just did some very interesting studies that part of what's happened over the last 20 years in the United States is as a result of us basically depressing immigrant wages through our immigration system, where we've been increasing the demand for immigrant type of labor, particularly type of immigrant labor, and distorting the industries that are actually now growing even more dependent on this immigrant labor. So how do we, the question is, how do we systematically go reversing this? What are the policy options?